My name is Chloe. I was 27 years old when I realized my name had become a whisper in my own family. Not out of fear, not out of respect, but out of shame. The kind of shame that only clings to a person when they're broke. That winter, snow fell heavy over the town of Blackridge, a sleepy patch of pine and prayer tucked between the Blue Ridge Mountains. I lived in a rented room above the dressmaker's shop on Willow Street. The wallpaper curled at the corners, and the stove hissed like a snake when the wind blew in from the cracks. But it was warm, and it was mine. I hadn't always been poor. There was a time when I wore satin gloves and danced at holiday parties with the other Wrenfields, my cousins in velvet, my sister's laugh echoing through pine halls, my mother's eyes silently judging every hemline and posture. We were once the kind of family who sent handwritten invitations on thick parchment and signed our names with a family crest. But that was before Papa's business collapsed, before Mama grew colder than the snow outside, before I fell in love with Eli Monroe, a man with a guitar and a crooked smile, who promised me Tennessee stars and gave me nothing but debts and abandonment. He left in the middle of a July night, taking my savings, my trust, and my wedding band with him. When my family found out, they didn't offer comfort, they offered distance. My sister Lorraine called it embarrassing. My cousin Matthew said I was dramatic, and my mother, she said nothing at all. For 2 years, I lived quietly, stitching dresses for half wages, counting pennies for rent, and ignoring the emptiness where my pride once lived. And then came December 17th, a telegram arrived at the dress shop, addressed to the owner but intended for my ears. Wrenfield. Family gathering to be held at Brayford Mountain Lodge, December 24th, 26th. Private rental. No guests without written invitation. I read it once, then again. My name wasn't on the list. I hadn't been invited. They had rented the grandest log cabin in all of Brayford County, a $1.2 million retreat with stone fireplaces, chandeliers made of antlers, and a view of the snowy ridgeline that could humble God himself. I stood there, holding a needle in one hand and the telegram in the other, and I felt a crack not in my heart, but in my resolve. It wasn't just the rejection. It was the memory of every cold glance, every snub, every letter left unanswered. It was the silence after Eli left, the pity, the shame I had swallowed like soup for 2 winters. They thought I was nothing. They forgot I was a Wrenfield too, and what they didn't know was that I had a plan, because the cabin wasn't yet paid for in full. The owner, an old man named Russell Clay, a gruff widower I once mended coats for, and Mr. Clay had confided in me, just 2 weeks prior, that he was tired of managing the property himself and looking to sell quietly without fuss. That night, I walked through the snow to his homestead with my ledger in one hand and a wild idea in the other. When he opened the door, pipe in his mouth, eyes full of mountain silence, I said, "Mr. Clay, how much for the Brayford Lodge if I paid in full in cash?" His brow raised. He knew I didn't look like money, but appearances, as my family loved to say, are for show ponies. What they didn't know was that while they mocked me, I had been investing quietly land deeds, timber stocks, and small mill shares in Ashe County. And earlier that fall, I had sold 3 of them to a traveling developer for just over $1.4 million. I was still the poor girl in their minds, but I was about to become the owner of their Christmas. Mr. Russell Clay didn't speak for a long moment. He just stared at me, at my frayed gloves, at the mud on my hem, at the determined stillness in my jaw. "You got that kind of money, Miss Wrenfield?" he asked slowly, like the idea made his bones itch. "I do," I replied, and reached into my coat, pulling out a folded letter of credit from the Ashe County banking house, signed by Judge Halpern himself. Mr. Clay took it, turned it over, and gave a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, "the broke girl with the prettiest stitch in town just outbid the whole county." I didn't smile. I simply said I'd like the deed signed before December 22nd. He chuckled and stepped aside, motioning me in. "You got grit, girl. Come on in before the frost bites your toes off." We signed the documents over hot cider and a fire that crackled like it knew what I was up to. When I left his house, the deed was folded tight against my chest like a secret no one else deserved to know. The next day, I walked into the Brayford County Clerk's office and officially registered the transfer of ownership. The woman at the desk, an old family friend of Mama's, did a double take when she saw my name. "You bought the lodge?" she asked, blinking twice. I leaned in just a little. "Paid in full." By December 21st, the lodge was legally mine. Now came the twist. The Wrenfields had booked the property weeks prior, thinking the old man would hold it for them until Christmas Eve. They had wired a partial deposit, just enough to secure the dates, but hadn't yet paid the remainder. So I sent a letter, on my newly printed letterhead, Wrenfield Mountain Holdings LLC. Dear Lorraine, due to a recent change in ownership, the Brayford Lodge's standard rates have been updated. Effective immediately, the rental cost for December 24th to 26th has doubled. Payment in full must be received by noon on the 23rd or the reservation will be released. Sincerely, Nova Wrenfield owner, Brayford Mountain Lodge. I sealed it with wax and sent it with a courier who used to run errands for Papa's law office. He didn't say a word when I handed him the envelope. Just tipped his hat and rode off. I could only imagine their faces when the letter arrived. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout. The morning of the 22nd, my sister Lorraine stormed into the dress shop, boots tracking snow and her breath fogging the window panes. She wore a velvet coat trimmed in white fur and a look that could curdle cream. You think this is funny, Nova? She snapped, shoving the letter into my hands. Is this some kind of joke? I looked her straight in the eye, calm as the snow falling outside. It's a business decision, I said. Lodge rates have gone up. Inflation, you understand. She scoffed. You're out of your mind. We don't have that kind of money just lying around. I raised an eyebrow. Funny. I was told you had a Christmas budget. Her cheeks flushed red. She was never good at losing, even worse at being caught off guard. You bought the whole damn cabin just to spite us? I folded the letter carefully and set it back in her hands. No, Lorraine. I bought it because I could. She stormed out, spitting curses into the wind. But I wasn't done yet. That night, I personally oversaw the decorating of the lodge. I hired 4 local girls to help me hang garlands, light candles, and prepare the hearth. We filled the great hall with holly and pine, laid velvet runners across the tables, and stacked wood high beside every fireplace. I even had the old piano tuned. On the morning of the 24th, as the Wrenfields scrambled to find another venue, I stood on the porch of the lodge in a deep green dress, hair pinned high, watching the snow fall like confetti from the heavens. And then just before dusk, an idea came to me. A real revenge isn't just denying someone a seat at the table. A real revenge is making the table bigger and choosing who gets a plate. So I sent a second wave of letters, this time, to every girl who ever worked beside me at the dress shop. To Mrs. Alden, the baker who lost her husband and never got invited anywhere. To the children who sang carols outside our church but never had proper mittens. I invited them all to the Christmas Eve feast at Brayford Lodge. The table was long, the fire warm, and for the first time in years I didn't feel like the forgotten Wrenfield. I felt like Nova, the one who rose, the one who remembered everyone else they forgot. The lodge came alive like something out of a painting. Oil lamps flickered beside windows frosted with snow. The scent of roasted goose, cinnamon bread, and mulled cider filled the grand room, mingling with the sweet sound of the piano played beautifully by little Emma Sue, the orphan girl from our church choir. She wore a green ribbon in her hair and gloves I had sewn myself. It was the most beautiful Christmas I'd ever known, and it wasn't because of the food or the decorations. It was because the room was full of kindness, not judgment. People weren't whispering about how much I had. They were grateful that they had a place to belong. Each guest who arrived was handed a pine wreath and invited to write one thing they were thankful for on a red ribbon. We hung the wreaths around the fireplace like portraits of gratitude. And I tied my ribbon quietly and wrote just 2 words myself. Returned. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How a woman can lose herself piece by piece, not even realizing it until one day she wakes up and can't find the fire in her soul. But that night, surrounded by neighbors, seamstresses, and children with bright eyes and empty plates, I realized I'd found that fire again, and I had built a place to let it burn freely. I stood by the grand hearth, a mug of cider in my hand, watching laughter bloom like wildflowers across faces that once knew only winters of hardship. Brayford Lodge didn't feel like a building anymore. It felt like a home, not just mine, but ours. Around 8 o'clock, just as the choir started singing the first Noel, I saw a shadow in the snow just beyond the lodge gates, tall, familiar, wrapped in wool, but unmistakably my brother Matthew. He was the only one who hadn't been entirely cruel when Papa lost the lumber business. Quiet, yes. Spineless, maybe. But not cruel. I opened the front doors myself. Matthew, I said, arms crossed, the chill of the wind and the past both trying to creep in. He removed his hat slowly, his brown hair dusted with flakes. Nova, he said with a nod, didn't expect to see you so tall. I've been tall for a while. You just weren't looking. He smiled sheepishly, looking past me into the warm light spilling from the doorway. Lorraine's been crying all day. Mama's furious. Said you embarrassed the family. I raised an eyebrow. Did I? Or did I just prove I still am one? He sighed. She says it's a disgrace, and I said calmly, that this is the first Christmas in years that doesn't feel like a performance. He looked down at his boots, then back up at me. May I come in? I hesitated. I thought about how he laughed when Eli ran off, how he shrugged when Mama said I was better off gone. But I also remembered how, when we were children, he covered for me when I tore my petticoat playing in the orchard. Only if you're hungry, I said. He stepped inside, warmth rushing around him like a baptism. He didn't speak for a while, just stood near the fire, watching the people dance and laugh, his eyes full of some emotion I couldn't name. I walked over to refill the cider. You were always the smart one, Nova, he said quietly. We just didn't like it when you got louder than the rest of us. I set the ladle down. Maybe you should have listened harder. He nodded. We were wrong, all of us. The words weren't enough to undo the years, but they were a crack in the dam. And that was enough for now. The music played on. Children unwrapped handmade gifts I had sewn from leftover fabric. Women cried tears of joy over hot soup and soft quilts. Emma Sue finished playing and was given a standing ovation. It was late when the last guest left. Only candlelight remained, flickering across garlanded walls and wreaths filled with thank you ribbons. Matthew helped me gather the dishes. He even wiped the counter with the awkward hands of a man who wasn't used to earning forgiveness. You really bought this whole place? He asked. Yes, I said, and I'll keep it. Turn it into a winter retreat for widows and women in need. He blinked. A charity lodge? No, I replied. A restoration lodge. For women who were forgotten, left behind, or laughed at, like you. I met his gaze. Exactly like me. Outside, snow began to fall again, quiet and soft, as if blessing what had happened inside. Before he left, Matthew turned on the porch and asked, do you think, maybe next Christmas, we could all come here together? I didn't answer right away, not because I hadn't forgiven him, but because forgiveness takes time. And sometimes revenge has its own clock. The morning after Christmas, I walked the empty halls of the lodge in silence. The garlands still hung fresh over the banisters. Ribbons on the wreaths fluttered with the soft breath of mountain wind sneaking in through the old stone walls. I traced my fingers over the polished wooden table, now cleared of dishes but rich with memory. It had been a success, but now came the part no one ever prepares for, not the celebration, but the after. I sat by the fireplace with a quilt around my shoulders, the same one I had stitched from remnants of old dresses I once mended for pennies. The same quilt I wrapped myself in the night Eli left and took the last of my trust with him, Eli Monroe. I hadn't thought of him in weeks, but in the quiet stillness, he rose again in my mind like smoke curling up from damp wood. The man who ruined me, or so I once believed. The man who walked out with my life savings, my dignity, and the ring he swore he'd never take off. He hadn't returned to Blackridge since that summer night. Not until that morning. I was just pouring coffee when a knock sounded at the back door, sharp and hesitant, like someone uncertain whether they deserved to be heard. I opened it slowly, and there he stood, Eli Monroe, still tall, still too handsome for his own good, but leaner now. His coat was torn, and the brim of his hat was wilted from rain. He looked more like a ghost than a man. Nova, he said, his voice rough with cold. I heard what you did about the lodge. I narrowed my eyes, saying nothing. He shuffled his boots. I was in Ellicott, down near the border. Word gets around. You bought the place, threw some grand party, doubled the price on the Wrenfields. Folks are calling you a legend. I crossed my arms. And what does that make you, Eli? He swallowed hard. A fool. I didn't flinch. Took you long enough. I came to apologize. The room stayed still. Even the wind paused at the window panes. He continued. I was scared of settling, of being a nobody. I thought if I could just get a little money, your money, I could go west and make something of myself. I told myself I'd come back for you. You never did, I replied. He looked down. Because I lost everything within a year. Every cent I stole from you. gone to whiskey and broken horses. I slept in barns, ate from missions, and every time someone said your name back, home, I wanted the earth to swallow me. I didn't move. My heart beat, slow and steady, like I'd trained it to. I don't want anything, he said finally, just your forgiveness, if you can find it. I poured a second cup of coffee and handed it to him. Sit, I said, motioning to the hearth. He blinked in surprise. You're letting me in? You're not staying, I said calmly, but I'll hear you out. Because while I may not forgive you today, I refuse to let your shame ruin my morning brew. He sat quietly, sipping his coffee like a man afraid to breathe, and I stared at the fire. The truth was, once, I loved him more than my own breath. I'd imagined a life with him, singing by the river, raising children beneath the pines, growing old on a porch swing. But he broke that life like glass underfoot, and though the shards no longer bled me, I could still see the cracks. Do you regret it? I asked softly. All of it, he whispered. I nodded. Then that's yours to carry, not mine. He left before noon. No begging, no tears, just a man walking away from the ruins he built and realizing they no longer belonged to me. I watched him go, not with anger, but with a strange sense of closure. He had been a storm once. Now, he was just weather I had survived. That evening, I walked down to the town square. Children sledded on the hills. Storefronts were still decked in red and gold. And in the center of the square stood the town's oldest tree, draped in ribbons, each one holding a name of someone who had helped make Christmas warm for another. I added one last ribbon before I left out it read, for the girl they left out, who let herself back in. The days after Christmas were quiet, the sort of quiet that doesn't just settle outside, but inside a person too. Like the whole world paused to catch its breath after the thunder of tinsel and bells. I stayed at the lodge through New Year's. There was no rush to return to town, and I needed the stillness. I had spent years chasing peace, and now that I had it, I wasn't going to rush it away. On the third morning, I heard a knock, not hesitant like Eli's, not desperate like Lorraine's. No, this knock was crisp, familiar, sharp as peppermint. It was Mama. I hadn't seen her in nearly 2 years, not since the day she looked at me from across her parlor and said, "Maybe poverty will teach you a little humility." She stood at the door now, coat perfectly pressed, a hat pinned with winterberries tilted just so. Her face was pale, unreadable, lips painted like always, a woman armored in tradition. "Nova," she said. "Not cold, but not warm either. Just neutral." "Mama," I replied, opening the door just enough to meet her gaze. "I was in the area," she said, stepping past me without invitation. She had always entered rooms like she still owned them, even when she didn't. She paused in the great hall, eyes glancing over the stone hearth, the golden light of morning filtering through cathedral windows. Her silence was loud. I heard. "You bought it," she said finally. "The lodge." I nodded. "It's mine now." She touched the edge of a pine garland, her gloved fingers brushing the needles. "It's tasteful, not ostentatious." That was her way of giving a compliment without surrendering any pride. "I hosted Christmas here," I said, moving toward the hearth. "Invited everyone who never got an invitation from you." Her eyes flicked to mine. "So this was revenge, then?" "No," I said. "This was redemption." She didn't speak for a moment. Then she removed her gloves and laid them neatly on the sideboard. "I suppose you want an apology." I shook my head. "No, I want honesty." She inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that collects years of unspoken truths. "I was angry," she admitted. "When you left with Eli, I told myself it was your pride leading you off a cliff. And when he left you, I told myself you deserved it for disobeying. And now?" She sat on the velvet bench near the fire, crossing her ankles like a queen. "Now I see a woman who stood alone and did not fall." For the first time in my life, her voice trembled. "I resented your strength, Nova, because it showed me my own weakness. I married for comfort, not love. I built a life that looked proper on the outside but hollowed me from within. I didn't speak. I let her confess in the only way she knew how, by untangling truths like a hem ripped open. "I should have invited you. You're my daughter. You didn't want me there," I said calmly. "Not because I embarrassed you, but because I reminded you that survival doesn't always look dignified." She looked up at me with tears starting to line the edge of her lashes. I had never seen her cry, not even at Papa's funeral. "You've always had fire in you," she whispered, "and I never knew how to love it without being afraid of being burned." I sat across from her and poured us both tea. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no sudden embrace, just the quiet understanding of two women who had once lived in the same house but entirely different worlds. I don't hate you, I said. She nodded. That's more than I deserve. We sipped in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound between us. After she left, she paused at the door and turned back. Next Christmas, she said, I'll send you an invitation, if you'll still have us. I didn't answer. Immediately, I thought about every lonely night, every skipped letter, every cold Sunday where I sat at the back of the church alone. I thought about the way it felt to be erased from your own family portrait. Then I met her eyes and said softly, that depends. On what? On whether next time you come to see your daughter, or to save face. She nodded once, as if that answer was fairer than she'd expected. And then she was gone. That night, I lit the fireplace again and sat with my quilt, alone but not lonely. And I realized something. Revenge isn't just about making others feel what they made you feel. It's about reclaiming the power they tried to take from you. And mine was fully, fiercely returned. By the time New Year's Eve arrived, I had grown into the walls of the lodge like ivy, quiet, clinging, resilient. It was mine now, through and through. From the mahogany banister I'd polished myself, to the oak-paneled den where I'd sat reading until dawn, tracing each crack in the stone like it carried my name. The snow outside was ankle-deep. Ice clung to the trees like glass. The whole world felt still, waiting, watching. That afternoon, as I arranged candles along the mantel, I heard a familiar voice call out from the doorway, Nova? I turned. Matthew, my older brother, the one who used to walk me to school when I was too scared to go alone, the one who, more recently, told me, you can't keep embarrassing this family with your stubborn pride. He stood awkwardly, holding his hat in his hands, his boots dripping slush onto the rug. I didn't know if I should come, he said. Mama said you spoke. At length, she was invited, I replied, not harshly. She showed up. He looked around, then up at the vaulted ceiling. You did well. It's beautiful. I nodded. It is, and it's open to anyone who's been told they don't belong. He glanced at the long table set for one. Still eating alone? I didn't flinch. Not always. He cleared his throat. Lorraine, my wife, she regrets what she said. She said I was a stain on the family name. I replied calmly. I believe she meant it. Matthew winced. I didn't come to defend her, he said. I came because I thought you should know. Mama's been telling people she never meant to exclude you, that it was a misunderstanding. I laughed, low and bitter. Families like ours don't make mistakes. We make statements and pretend. They're misunderstandings when the wind changes. He didn't deny it. We sat in silence for a while. I handed him a cup of cider. He didn't drink it. Then he said, the lodge was always Papa's favorite place. He used to say if he ever disappeared, it'd be to these hills. I remember, I said. That's why I bought it. He looked at me differently then, not with pity, but with something closer to regret. I thought you'd fall apart, he admitted. After Eli, after everything, I thought you wouldn't make it. I smiled faintly. Then maybe you never really knew me. A gust of wind howled against the window, and for a second we just sat there, two Wrenfield children, all grown now, all changed by time and silence and pride. Before he left, he turned at the door. If we invited you next year, would you come? I studied him. Not the words, but the man behind them. Not if I'm a guest, I said. Only if I'm family. He nodded, his jaw tight. Then I hope we'll see you at the table. When he left, I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumph. Just a strange, settling calm. That night, I lit every candle in the great hall. The flames danced, bright and defiant. And then, as midnight neared, I opened the front doors wide and stepped out onto the porch, watching the sky. Above the pines, a single firework burst, a distant celebration, too far to hear, but it didn't matter, because I was no longer the girl on the outside looking in. I was the woman who built the inside with her own two hands. January brought its own kind of silence, cleaner, heavier, as if the air itself had exhaled after the holidays and didn't quite know what to do next. Back in town, people still whispered about what I'd done. Some called it scandalous. Others called it genius. But no matter their words, the look in their eyes when they passed me on Main Street had changed. I was no longer per Nova, the girl who'd been left behind. I was Miss Wrenfield, the woman who bought a mountain lodge out from under her own kin. Respect is a strange thing in small towns. It moves slow, like honey on cold bread. But once it sticks, it stays. I returned to the dress shop 2 weeks later, not because I needed the money, but because I still loved the sound of scissors gliding through fabric and the scent of fresh cotton bolts. Mrs. Hale, the shop's owner, clapped her hands when I walked in. Well, if it isn't the Queen of the Ridge, she laughed. I shook my head. Just Nova, same girl who stitched 50 hems a week and took her lunch behind the curtain. She handed me a roll of burgundy velvet. Then welcome back. There's an order for the pastor's daughters. 4 dresses, modest, but festive. I smiled. Let's get to work. By noon, I was at my sewing table, needle dancing between my fingers, when the bell above the front door jingled. I looked up to see Margaret Tilley, the town's most relentless gossip, striding in like she owned the weather. She eyed me like I was a new kind of animal. Didn't expect to see you working, she sniffed. Not after all your success. I met her gaze calmly. Money doesn't make my hands stop wanting to create. She clicked her tongue. Well, you always were odd. Thank you, I replied sweetly. I'll take that as a compliment. She flinched slightly, and I knew right then. People like Margaret don't fear power. They fear women who use power and stay graceful doing it. After she left, Mrs. Hale leaned over the counter and said, "You know what I heard?" I raised a brow. Word is, the town council wants to invite you to join the committee for winter planning. I laughed. The same council that didn't invite me to the harvest dinner last year? She smirked. Same one. Apparently, they think you've redeemed yourself. Redeemed. The word sat strange in my chest. As if dignity had ever been something they owned in the first place, only to hand it back when they saw fit. Still, I nodded politely. I'll think about it. That night, back at the lodge, I stared out at the frozen lake, now dusted with snow. The cabin was quiet again, but not empty. It held stories, now my stories. I picked up a journal and began writing them down. Not for a book, not for show, just to remember, to never let myself forget how far I'd climbed after falling so deep. January 16th, I wrote. Eli's debt was loss. My family's debt was silence. My own debt was to myself, and now it's paid. I slept deeply that night, the kind of rest that only comes after years of unrest. The next morning, a letter arrived, handwritten, elegant, the kind I hadn't seen in years. It was from my cousin Vivian, the only member of the Wrenfield family who had never spoken ill of me, though she hadn't defended me either. Dearest Nova, I've heard what you've done. The whispers, the pride, the scandal. And I wanted to say only this. You didn't just win, you changed the whole game. I hope, one day, I can be as brave as you. With admiration, Vivian. For the first time in days, I cried, not because of anger, not because of sadness, but because someone had finally seen me not as a rebel, not as a girl gone wild, but as a woman who stood her ground. It was a strange thing, holding that letter, a simple note really. But it meant more than any apology. It meant someone from my bloodline had chosen truth over gossip. February came with heavy snows, and Brayford Mountain turned white as lace. The world felt quieter than ever, like it was watching to see what I'd do next. I had never planned beyond revenge. That part was honest. Buying the cabin, raising the price, throwing the feast, turning their insult into a coronation. It was the kind of poetic justice you read about in books tucked under your bed. But what happens after revenge? What fills the space once anger has been served cold and the hunger's gone? I found my answer in the women, the ones who started coming to the lodge every weekend. First, just 2 of them: Grace, who was left by her husband with 3 children, and Ruthie, who had buried her fiancé winters ago. They came to sit by the fire, to mend what life had torn. I offered them tea. They asked to stay longer. By the second week of February, there were 12 women, each with their own stories. Bruises and brittle laughter. We turned one of the unused guest rooms into a sewing corner, another into a reading nook. The large dining hall became a place for stories, not just meals. Women who had never spoken in town before found common ground beneath my roof. I didn't expect it to become a retreat, but perhaps a home made of pain always knows how to open its doors to others who felt the same. One day, as I was restocking linens in the upper loft, I found myself humming a tune Mama used to sing while brushing my hair, long before things went cold between us. I didn't stop. I let the melody fill the space, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. Later that evening, as the wind howled outside and the fire roared inside, Ruthie pulled a folded paper from her apron and placed it in my hand. A few of us took a vote, she said with a smile. I raised an eyebrow. A vote? She nodded. We'd like to name this place officially. We think it deserves more than the Wrenfield Lodge. I unfolded the paper. In looping script, written in ink and care, were 3 words: the Hearth House. Below it, 20 signatures. My throat tightened. A house with a hearth wasn't just a place, it was a promise. Warmth, shelter, a reason to keep going. I nodded. Then it's settled. The Hearth House it is. The next week, I painted a wooden sign and nailed it above the grand doors. From that day on, people no longer called it Nova's Revenge Lodge. They called it a sanctuary, but not everyone liked the change. One March morning, a man arrived in a fine coat and riding boots. He introduced himself as Mr. Everett Hale, a cousin to the town's mayor and head of the Brayford Historical Board. He walked through the halls of my lodge like he was measuring it for his own nameplate. This is valuable land, he said, tapping the stone with his cane. The kind that belongs in respectable hands. I narrowed my eyes. And you think mine aren't? He smiled with teeth to white. You're a young woman, Miss Wrenfield, with a colorful past. Our concern is legacy, image, the kind of thing that's remembered. And what exactly are you suggesting? I asked, though I already knew. A buyout, he said, slipping a paper onto the table. A generous one. You sell the property, and we convert it into a winter museum. Historical preservation, you understand. I looked at the paper. The number was high, much higher than I paid, but not high enough to buy what I had built. I slid it back to him. No, he tilted his head. Think carefully. These mountains have long memories, but they favor old money, not scandal. I stood. Then let the mountains remember me for the scandal. He left with a polite nod and eyes that promised trouble. The next week, I received 3 surprise inspections from the fire marshal, a sudden tax notice from the county office, and a whispered rumor in town that the lodge was harboring fallen women. Funny how quickly old power rises when new power is born, but I didn't bend. I hired a lawyer, Miss Annabel Cartwright, the only woman attorney this side of the state, and we filed paperwork to register the Hearth House as a charitable rest home for women in hardship. If they wanted to fight me with tradition, I'd beat them with law. By the time spring arrived, the snow had melted, but I had not. I was steel beneath the soil now, roots in stone, and while others plotted how to erase me from the town's ledger, I was busy writing myself into its future. The Hearth House became a storm the town couldn't contain. By April, it was no longer just whispers and side glances. The mayor's office had received over 30 letters from women, from widowers, from visiting doctors and traveling nuns, all praising the sanctuary we'd created. Women who had arrived broken were now working as seamstresses, painters, bakers, and healers. Some stayed for weeks, others just for a night, but all left different than they came. I kept every letter in a carved cedar box near the fireplace. Each word was proof that my revenge had grown roots and bloomed into something no one could burn down. Still, the council didn't give up so easily. At the Maytown meeting, held inside the old brick courthouse, I was formally invited to speak. I wore my best indigo dress, stitched by hand, with silver thread lining the cuffs, a quiet reminder of where I came from. The room was full. I recognized every face. Some once laughed when I was run out of town. Some had tried to apologize. Most hadn't looked me in the eye since. Mayor Thomas Halbrook cleared his throat. Miss Wrenfield, he said stiffly, thank you for joining us. As you know, concerns have been raised regarding the purpose and legality of your establishment on Brayford Mountain. I smiled politely. Yes, I've read the complaints, all unsigned, I might add. A few councilmen shifted in their seats. He continued, there are suggestions that your lodge, now dubbed the Hearth House, is operating outside appropriate zoning, that it hosts activities that may damage the town's reputation, such as feeding widows? I asked. A woman in the back chuckled. The mayor scowled. Miss Wrenfield, he said, your attitude is noted. But this council must consider the long-term image of Blackridge. The mountain has always belonged to tradition, families, institutions, and now, I said, standing, it belongs to restoration. I paused, letting the echo of my voice fill the chamber. You want tradition? I asked. Then honor the women who held this town up while their husbands drank, while their sons ran, and while your council meetings passed resolutions that did nothing for the poor. A murmur spread. I walked to the center of the room and opened the cedar box I had brought with me. One by one, I laid out letters, testimonials, a girl from Fallow Creek who had fled an abusive uncle, a widow from Fairview who had nowhere to go after her husband's factory closed, a pregnant woman from the north who had been abandoned at a train station with nothing but a suitcase. All of these women came through the Hearth House, I said, and all of them walked out with hope. The room was silent now. Even the mayor had no reply. Then, from the back, a single clap. It was Annabel Cartwright, my attorney, her gloved hands slow and deliberate. She stepped forward. For the record, she said, the Hearth House is fully compliant under the Rest Homes and Women's Welfare Statute of 1896, and I have notarized confirmation from the county registrar. Any further attempt to shut it down would be considered harassment and met with suit. The mayor turned pale. I closed the cedar box, nodded, and said, "This meeting is over. Unless, of course, you'd like to discuss opening a second location?" Gasps, stifled laughs, but mostly silence. I left the courthouse with my chin high. That night, back at the lodge, I was greeted with flowers. Not roses, not anything fancy, just wildflowers picked from the riverbank by the children of the women I'd sheltered. A quiet thank you from little hands that didn't yet know how to say the words. I wept again, not out of sadness but pride. That summer, Hearth House added 2 more rooms, then a garden, then a library built from donated books. We taught women to read, to cook, to write, to lead. We gave them back their names. Mama visited once a month, never with judgment, always with a gift. She was trying in the only way she knew, quietly, awkwardly, but honestly. Matthew brought his children and helped paint the shutters. Vivian mailed me clippings of editorials from other towns who wrote about the woman who built her castle from ashes. And Eli? I never saw him again, but I heard, through the grapevine, that he ended up working as a stable hand in a northern town. He drinks less, speaks little, lives small. Sometimes revenge doesn't roar. Sometimes it just outgrows the pain. That fall, I stood before the Hearth House with a new sign, where no woman knocks in shame. As leaves turned gold and the wind whispered through pine, I felt something I hadn't in years. Not anger, not hurt, legacy. 1 year, that's all it took for everything to change. The same family who once whispered that I was too proud to beg now sent Christmas cards with carefully penned apologies. My brother Matthew invited me to dinner with his wife and children. His son even called me Aunt Nova, a name I hadn't heard in a decade. Mama no longer wore pearls when she visited. She came in her gardening clothes, and we shared tea under the maple trees out back. And the Hearth House, it didn't just grow, it bloomed. By December, we had hosted over 70 women. Some stayed a week, some months. Many left to build their own shops, join schools, or reunite with family they once believed would never take them back. Each story, each letter, felt like a stone lifted off my chest. On Christmas Eve, a year after the night they left me out, in the cold, I lit a fire in the great hall just like before. The table was long, set with pine cones and silver napkins. The same chandelier above, the same wind howling beyond the frosted glass. But this time, the guests were not the people who had cast me out. They were the people I had chosen to bring in. Women who once walked in shadows now laughed under candlelight. Ruthie stood beside me in the kitchen, baking pies with children hanging off her apron strings. Grace led carols near the piano, her voice strong despite the scar above her collarbone. Even Annabel, never one to linger, stayed through dessert, sipping cider and discussing land rights with a woman from the East. I stood back and watched them all, the community I had built with my own hands. And then I heard it, footsteps crunching on snow outside. I opened the door and froze. My father's brother, Uncle Grant, stood there in a worn coat, holding a lantern. Behind him, the entire Wrenfield family, my cousins, aunts, even the same uncle who once said, "That girl'll never amount to more than thread and spit." Mama stepped forward. "I asked them to come," she said softly, "not for you to forgive them, but because they needed to see you." I didn't speak. Uncle Grant removed his hat. "Nova," he said, his voice lower than I remembered, "you built something real here, and we were wrong, all of us." Vivian stepped beside him. "You were the only one who had the courage to walk away and the strength to come back better." I looked at their faces, ashamed, unsure, then back at the firelight behind me. I didn't forget what they'd done, but I also didn't need to carry it anymore. So I stepped aside and opened the door. "Dinner's warm," I said simply. They entered in silence, and though no one said it aloud, I could feel it in the way they moved, the humility, the awe. They weren't just visiting a cabin, they were stepping into a legacy. Later that night, after the laughter had softened and the embers dimmed, I walked outside. The stars were diamonds on velvet. The wind was sharp, but my coat was thick. Eli once told me I'd freeze without him. Turns out, I only needed a good tailor and a steady fire. I looked at the hearth house, its windows glowing gold, its chimney trailing smoke into the heavens. I thought of all I had lost: my money, my love, my place at the family table. But none of that compared to what I had gained: a home, a purpose, a voice. I had taken their rejection, their mockery, their abandonment, and I turned it into the one thing they never expected: power. Not the kind with crowns and titles, but the kind that comes from knowing who you are, even when the world tells you otherwise. And so, this Christmas, I wasn't sitting outside a rented lodge watching the lights flicker from afar. I was inside the one I owned, surrounded by the family I built. Questions for you, reader. Have you ever been underestimated like Nova? What would you have done if your family shut you out? Do you believe revenge is best served with power or peace? Subscribe to more revenge stories. Share, like, comment.